In the early days of League, most of the roster was designed around fulfilling traditional archetypes in a literal sense. For example, you had your generic Minotaur frontline tank in the form of Alistar, you had your typical archer/huntsman through Ashe, you had your mage in the form of Ryze, an assassin in the form of Katarina, an enchanter like Janna, a berserker like Tryndamere. Almost everyone in some way, shape, or form could be closely related to a video game trope from an RPG or something. Not a bad thing, mind you, there's a reason why tropes become tropes. Point being, champion design early on placed a greater emphasis on checking things off a list compared to now where it's more about every release going after a certain theme. A positive aspect of this approach was that it made characters more recognizable and therefore easier to pick up even by players who've never played a MOBA in their lives, and it was essential in establishing the various classes we know all too well today: fighters, mages, tanks, marksmen, slayers, what have you. However, a negative outcome was that many of those champs lived and died by their archetypal strengths and weaknesses, resulting in many of them needing visual gameplay updates in an attempt to introduce more nuance to their gameplay. One that embodied a very black and white approach to League's design philosophy was Kale, whose current and previous iterations symbolized the idea of scaling on top of being your garden variety angel character. She would start a game out noticeably weaker than any of her peers, but would gradually evolve into a destructive force of destiny that could 1v9 carry harder than even ADCs. Yet despite having such an appealing premise, her experience was flawed enough to warrant a rework. So let's dive into her history with Kayle's Rework, a retrospective. Before we continue though, I have a quick shout out for today's sponsor, the Hextech store. It's a place where you can purchase Hextech crafting related items like orbs, chests, or keys at a discounted price. If you like to buy orbs and chests or just skins in general, you can get more for your money by using their store. After purchase, they gift you the items in-game. You can use my code VARS for an added discount on top of their already discounted prices. It's a trustworthy site with fast delivery, so feel free to check it out. Thanks again to Hextech Store for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's get back into it. As mentioned already, the idea behind Kale was that she started out really weak, but had many different scaling metrics that would significantly magnify her pressure as time went on. There were other champions alongside her who were late game scalers, but out of all of them, she had the most extreme transformation from borderline worthless to arguably the strongest hyper carry in the game at level 18 with 6 items, and that statement might still hold true even now. Unlike other old champions with movesets so bad Riot had to go above and beyond to reimagine them, Kale was comparatively not too big of a problem all things considered. It was very stat checky in nature, but there was a win condition she wanted to reach and had the means to do so, without necessarily relying on degenerate or cheesy strategies in the same way as our previous entry Nunu. That said, designing a late game scaling hypercarry was and still is a challenge in light of having to massively underpower them early game to make it onerous for the player to get to that point, but not too underpowered to where they fall so far behind that it renders their scaling null and void since they lost before they could even get to that point. Even more pressing of an issue was that Kale was the only one of her kind to have supportive elements. Generally, hypercarries have selfish kits. They often provide no utility for their team, and what little they do carry is primarily meant to benefit them, such as the case of the likes of Master Yi, Kassadin, Fiora, and Kog'Maw to name a few. In doing so, it was easy to gauge how well or poorly they were performing since there were no external factors influencing their stats. Kale was the exception to this, with 2 of her abilities being able to affect allies, one of which is a super ultimate and an infinite value ability. Additionally, she had a lot of different elements that are very rare if not unique only to her, meaning there was nothing Riot could use as a reference to judge how effective it would be in practice. The lack of a benchmark to evaluate her was largely responsible for why she had to receive not 1 but 2 major overhauls. Technically only the first was a visual gameplay update since the second didn't change her visuals in any way, but the adjustments to the latter were significant enough to fundamentally alter many things within her kit and by extension her playstyle. Kale is one of very few ranged champions in League who altered between melee and range form. The only others at the time were shapeshifters like Nidalee, only Kale had this in the form of a buff. Righteous Fury was her shining virtue, passively dealing bonus magic damage with her basic attacks, making her a hybrid scaler as well. When activating the ability, she would gain a long-lasting buff that changed her into a ranged champion with an attack range in the same vein as a standard marksman, and the magic damage on her basic attacks would double while splashing on enemies around the initial target, much like Ravenous Hydra. Given its base duration of 10 seconds and a 14-second cooldown at rank 5, it was very possible for Kale to have Righteous Fury's uptime last indefinitely, as 30% cooldown reduction would be significant enough for the duration to exceed its cooldown, and Nashor's Tooth provided 20% back then. Not only did Kale deal hybrid damage, not only was she a ranged attacker, but she also did AoE damage with her attacks, and it wasn't just a small bit either, seeing as it did the full bonus damage on top of almost half her AD. Obviously, with this ability revolving around her autos, building attack speed would amplify its effectiveness in tandem with standard attack damage and ability power. Furthermore, her passive Holy Fervor would shred both armor and magic resist by 15%, and it was already difficult to itemize against hybrid damage, let alone dealing with this. Her Q and W served to make it easier for her to kite out or chase down enemies. Reckoning was a point-and-click spell that applied a rather strong slow for a full 3 seconds. If her opponent had no mobility, then they were completely exposed with this. Divine Blessing was a moderate heal and 3-second movement speed buff on her or an allied champion. With just a few AP items, she had the potential to outspeed anyone else in tempo for a brief moment, making her surprisingly hard to catch. This is where we encounter a balance issue. Kale is a pseudo-ranged champion with a self-heal, thus giving her sustain in the neutral. Granted, it had a 15-second cooldown, but that's a dangerous combination to have. Many hypercarries do have some semblance of healing in their kit, but it's balanced out by the fact that they're usually melee or can only pull the ceiling off while fighting enemy champions. It's almost never a good idea to give a ranged champion out of combat sustain unless they sacrifice their own health in some way, such as Vladimir. Additionally, being able to cast this on her allies gave her decent teamfight utility. And speaking of teamfight utility, Kale's ultimate was Intervention. With the cast range of 900 and no mana cost, she granted unconditional invulnerability to either herself or any one of her teammates for up to 3 seconds. No strings attached. Press the button and boom, you become immune to all damage. Tryndamere has a similar ability in the form of Undying Rage, but once again, what kept her from being overpowered was that he was a melee champion, therefore easy to kite without his dash, and he could only use it on himself. Kale was able to attach this to anyone on her team or herself. If used on herself, you essentially ended up with a ranged hypercarry with splash damage who can free fire on you for up to 3 seconds, and remember, she can slow you down while speeding herself up. In the early game, this wasn't much of an issue considering she had no attack speed or damage yet, but in the late game, 3 seconds of invincibility is enough for her to get in 6 to 8 autos if you have no way of stunning her. Alternatively, she could use Intervention on her ADC or someone else, granting them full freedom to do whatever the hell they wanted. Why this was such a problem was because the one weakness of hypercarries is that if they fall behind, they're of no use to the team since they're nothing but damage and usually no crowd control. Kale had enough utility to where she could provide for her team during the mid game even if she was behind while still slowly but surely scaling. That's not to say she had no weaknesses. Her unrivaled late game prowess came at the cost of an almost non-existent early game, but back then, League of Legends was a lot slower than it is now, even after version 12.10. The pressure to score an early lead wasn't as paramount, nor was it as punishing to fall behind. She had time on her side, and many people knew this too. Prior to her rework, she was consistently performing at well over a 50% win rate. The issue surrounding this was how polarizing of a champion she was. Again, you're looking at a range hybrid area damage auto attacker with the ability to make herself invincible for 3 seconds and all point and click abilities. The outcome was assured. If you had the right composition to shut her down early and or in teamfights, she lost. If you didn't, she won. Not exactly the most fun experience for either her or her opponents. Pragmatically though, she was fine. Clear weaknesses, clear strengths, had a function, and delivered on it pretty well. The interactions were just a little bit one-dimensional. In a way, old Kale suffered from the same problems as old Pantheon. Both were usable, and honestly if they never got reworked, they would still be viable even now, but some touching up was in order, so that's the approach Riot settled on for her VGU. And the first iteration of her rework painfully illustrated a lack of understanding of the main concern around her design. Polarity. Kale's abilities retained their basic premises but were modernized to widen their range of effect. Version 9.5 oversaw her full relaunch alongside Morgana. Now instead of her ranged properties being attached to a buff, it was transferred to her passive. Divine Ascent featured 3 phases of evolution based on the rank of her ultimate. Initially, basic attacks would grant her bonus attack speed stacking up to 5 times, and at full stacks, she became exalted, gaining increased movement speed towards enemies. She would then obtain an additional effect at level 6, 11, and 16. At level 6, while exalted, her auto attacks unleashed a wave of fire in a cone, so rather than a Ravenous Hydra passive, it became a Titanic Hydra passive. This is where splash damage went to as well. Then at level 11, she became a permanent ranged champion and her attack speed per stack was increased. Then at level 16, she became permanently exalted and the fire waves dealt true damage. Without even looking at the rest of her abilities, something was very wrong with this. In a vacuum, this is a very interesting way to add thresholds to a hypercarry scaling. There's a tangible power spike with each evolution. At rank 6, she got more wave clear, at rank 11, she got more range and DPS, at rank 16, she goes full 1v9. But her biggest flaw was how pathetically weak her early game was, even for the standards of a late game champion. All Kale was able to do at best was push waves and play neutral for a good 20 minutes. While she had very little kill pressure to speak of, giving herself range wave clear kept her from being collapsed on too early, and Divine Blessing was just enough for her to avoid being an easy target to catch. Divine Ascent took her poor laning phase and made it even worse. Now she had no consistent form of wave clear until level 6 and zero access to range attacks until level 11, all for a small 30% attack speed buff that meant nothing for her in lane. At first, it may seem like a necessary evil on account of her level 16 passive granting AoE true damage, and it is, but Kale didn't need a stronger late game. Her existing late game was already disgusting. What she needed was more agency in the early game so she could be a legitimate champion instead of spending the first 20 minutes praying, no pun intended, that her team could survive 4v5. In Riot's defense, passive aside, they more than succeeded in that department. Kale's active abilities were adjusted in a way that made them feel more skill expressive and less one-dimensional. For starters, Radiant Blast is a skill shot that can damage and slow multiple enemies, so they gave it the Pantheon Q treatment where it's no longer point and click but can now hit more than one target. Her old passive was added to Radiant Blast as well. In order to capitalize on the armor and magic resist shred, you had to land this ability first. Righteous Fury was changed to Starfire Spellblade, retaining the same magic damage passive but now having a different active, a ranged and powered auto attack prior to becoming ranged herself and did bonus missing health damage. Essentially, you can no longer remotely, albeit temporarily, access your ranged form. Her W could heal herself and a nearby allied champion, reducing the individual scaling, so you no longer had to choose between yourself and someone else, you could split it amongst both. Don't know how much I agree with that change, but at least they compensated with a lower heal and shorter speed boost. The biggest change, of course, was to her ultimate, now renamed Divine Judgment. While the duration remains the same, it now has an ability cost at early levels and a much longer cooldown to boot. Additionally, Kale is locked out of using basic attacks for at least a second and a half, preventing her from free firing on you during the entire duration. In exchange, Divine Judgment has a finishing attack that deals a pretty large amount of magic damage to all nearby enemies. Responses to the change were mixed. On one hand, there was more of an incentive to use it offensively now that it did damage, but on the other, it lowered how much of the duration she can actually attack for, enough to where she can barely attack at all while invincible. Regardless, her new base kit was noticeably healthier by design than before. There are more applications of them in teamfights and laning phase. But that said, a lot of that was overshadowed by her passive having great taste but awful execution in terms of what she needed. At level 16, she was indisputably the strongest champion in the game by every stretch of the imagination. Problem was, she would only ever get that far in maybe 1 out of every 30 games, considering how irrelevant she was until all the way to level 11. And even if she managed to survive to that point, she would only be on the same playing field as every other champ at level 11, meaning you saw no return on your investment till level 16. At that point, it begged the question, why even bother? And that was the main grievance everyone had with her right from the start. It didn't matter how good her Super Saiyan God Blue Kaioken Ultra Instinct 1v9999 form was, it was too inaccessible most of the time. And the few times you could access it, it was long after it was too late to make use of it, so she ended up getting another rework. Less than half a year after her VGU, she received another major overhaul to most of her abilities. In an effort to return more agency into her laning phase, Kale's bonus movement speed while exalted was halved, but now applies no matter what. Instead of having to wait until level 11 to become ranged, Kale's level 6 and 11 bonuses were swapped. Fire waves were moved to 11, and the range status was moved to 6. As to the level 16 bonus, the true damage was replaced instead with increased attack range, which at first was a nerf since it was only 50, but then in version 11.10, the bonus was doubled to 100, giving her an attack range of 625. Though it may appear to be a small adjustment, that simple change was enough to completely reimagine how players could approach Kale during each stage of the game. At level 6, she regained her ability to play neutral and CS at less danger to her own life, causing the remainder of laning phase to be relatively more comfortable for the one playing her. They had to siphon a huge amount of her late game strength to allow this change though, and for good reason. She didn't exactly get stronger early on, only safer, but a safer laning phase equals more consistency in reaching the power spikes that really drive her over the end. Unfortunately, this adjustment only cemented how awkward Kale's design philosophy is. Her old iteration was problematic in that it was too one-dimensional, leading to scenarios where she was either hard 1v9ing or hard feeding. The difference came down to matchups and how smart the player was in knowing when to focus on wave clear and when to actually try and fight their opponent. With her on-demand range being wrested away from the player, Kale's experience in lane devolves into surrendering all lane priority to her opponent until level 6, only throwing single instance range attacks with Starfire Spellblade and not much else. At level 6 is when playing laning phase reverted back to how old Kale was, only now you had slightly different tools at your disposal, but she still wasn't quite able to contend against the majority of mid-game threats until level 11. In essence, Kale's already poor early game agency was diminished even further, and the only thing she got in return was a few more use cases for her basic abilities, but that wasn't the focal point of her gameplay. The focal point was her being a ranged hyper carry, one that gradually amassed power as time went on. Present Kale is a ranged hyper carry, but segmenting her power spikes into evolutions had the adverse effect of stunting her growth phases. Rather than a straight curve upwards in strength, it was more like a set of stairs, a huge power spike followed by flatlining before the next one. Kale was no longer about gaining each level, getting more items. She was more like a survive until level 6, then survive until level 11, then survive until level 16. During this time, engaging against her lane opponent has no benefit for her, not exactly portraying the Holy Angel motif when much of the early game is spent hiding from your opponent. A lot of what I'm saying might sound familiar to those of you who watch my Karma retrospective, but the reason it works so well for her is that from a gameplay standpoint, Karma's new kit is vastly more engaging than the old one, even if it was at the cost of her duality. Kale's new mechanic is also more engaging than the old one, but it was at the cost of her agency, which is a far worse trade-off. What Kale needed was a Pantheon-esque rework, keep her gameplay exactly the same, and just retrofit her abilities to have more applications and skill expression rather than point-and-click stat checky stuff. that was it. They tried to fix what wasn't broken. So what are your thoughts on Kayle's rework? Do you believe it was for better or worse? Let me know in the comments down below. Apart from that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, join my Discord server, and check out my other retrospective episodes if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.